Shades of Pink opens on a portrait of a young woman whose entire emotional life has been organized around managing someone else's feelings, and this detail deserves to anchor the entire analysis. Because Alison's habit of monitoring and protecting her mother's moods, since the divorce, is not a minor character quirk, but a description of a child pressed into a caretaking role well before she had the emotional resources or life experience to occupy it safely, and this context matters enormously for understanding everything that follows. Because a young person raised to prioritize someone else's emotional stability over her own needs, wants, and instincts is a young person whose capacity to recognize and assert healthy boundaries in other relationships has likely been systematically undermined, making her particularly vulnerable to any adult who offers attentive listening and validation, regardless of that adult's actual motives. The layering of pressures the story places on Alison before Charlotte even enters the picture, the concealed bullying she cannot bring herself to disclose to her mother, the categorization by peers that forces a private identity question into public, humiliating visibility before she has had any chance to explore or claim that identity on her own terms, and the imposition of her mother's chosen path for her rather than the one she actually wants, establish a portrait of a young woman with essentially no safe outlet for honesty anywhere in her existing support structure. And this matters critically because it means that when Charlotte arrives and offers Alison the experience of being truly listened to, that experience lands with a disproportionate emotional force precisely because it is so rare and so needed, which is exactly the condition that makes a young person susceptible to attaching quickly and deeply to whoever provides it, regardless of whether that person is actually safe. It is important to name plainly what Charlotte's structural position actually is within the story, because however warmly the narrative frames her bubbly and empathetic demeanor, she has been hired by Alison's mother specifically as a professional coach, placed in a position of authority and influence over an 18-year-old client who is, by every measure the story itself establishes, in a state of significant emotional crisis and starved for genuine connection. And a professional in this kind of role carries a responsibility not to exploit the access and trust that role affords her, a responsibility that becomes especially significant given the power differential inherent in an adult mentor working closely with someone so young, so isolated, and so eager for any adult who will actually hear her. And the story's eventual choice to have Charlotte disclose her own sexuality specifically framed as a shared identity marker, "I'm just like you," in the context of ongoing one-on-one mentorship sessions, deserves to be read as a significant boundary crossing regardless of how the disclosure is emotionally framed. Because introducing this kind of personal, identity-based intimacy into a paid coaching relationship with a vulnerable teenager blurs a line that exists precisely to protect young people from adults who might, intentionally or not, use professional access to cultivate a closeness that exceeds appropriate mentorship. This is worth dwelling on specifically because the pattern the story depicts, an adult in a position of professional authority gradually building emotional intimacy with a vulnerable young person through attentive listening, patience, and validation, before eventually revealing a shared identity or interest that reframes the relationship as something more personal, is a recognizable structure that shows up in real accounts of boundary violations by mentors, coaches, and other adults granted trusted access to young people. And while the story frames Charlotte's eventual disclosure as a moment of beautiful mutual recognition, a queer elder offering a younger queer person the gift of not feeling alone, a genuinely critical reading has to hold space for the less comfortable possibility that this framing may be doing exactly the same cultural work identified in other entries in this catalog, dressing up a troubling power dynamic in the language of authentic connection, because the audience is meant to find the disclosure moving rather than concerning. It is also worth examining what this narrative choice implies about pageantry itself as an institution. Because Charlotte's assertion that pageantry is the perfect place for a young lesbian to get her start deserves scrutiny as a claim, rather than acceptance as a simple statement of fact within the story, since it positions an industry already built around intense scrutiny of young women's bodies, presentation, and performance of a specific kind of femininity, as somehow uniquely suited to nurturing queer identity development in a teenager, when a more skeptical reading might note that an industry demanding this level of physical self-monitoring and external validation from young women is precisely the kind of environment likely to compound, rather than resolve, the pattern of self-erasure and people-pleasing Alison has already been conditioned into by her family situation, and Charlotte's professional and financial stake in keeping Alison invested in pageantry, given that she has been hired specifically to coach her toward that path, should raise real questions about whether her encouragement, however genuinely felt, is entirely free of self-interest. The story's handling of Alison's actual desire, her stated wish to play soccer rather than pursue pageantry, deserves attention as well, because this detail establishes clearly that Alison already knows what she wants and has already articulated it, which makes the narrative's apparent decision to resolve her arc through continued involvement in pageantry now reframed as personally meaningful because of her connection with Charlotte, a troubling substitution of one form of externally imposed identity for another, replacing her mother's projected ambitions with her coach's validating presence, rather than actually empowering Alison to pursue the thing she independently named as her genuine interest. And this substitution matters because it suggests that Alison's path to self-actualization runs through continuing to accommodate the adults in her life, rather than through the harder, more valuable work of learning to trust and act on her own desires, regardless of what any adult figure, however well-intentioned, wants for her. There is real and valuable material buried in this premise. The genuine difficulty of growing up without a script for one's own identity. The specific loneliness of having your inner life discovered and categorized by peers before you have had any chance to define it yourself. The profound relief of encountering an adult who seems to understand something true about you that no one else in your life has acknowledged, but realizing that material, with integrity, would require the story to hold Charlotte to a higher standard of professional and ethical conduct than it currently seems to, allowing Alison to receive genuine support and validation, without that support being entangled with a disclosure that blurs the line between mentor and romantic prospect, and allowing Alison's eventual self-actualization to be rooted in reclaiming her own already stated desires, soccer, autonomy from her mother's projected path, rather than in continuing to organize her identity around what an authority figure in her life wants her relationship to pageantry, and by extension to that authority figure, to become. Queer teenagers and young adults deserve stories that model healthy boundaries between mentorship and romance precisely because so many of them, like Alison, arrive at moments of self-discovery already conditioned by family dynamics to prioritize adult approval over their own instincts, and a narrative willing to show an adult in a position of professional trust maintaining appropriate boundaries even while offering genuine warmth and validation would offer considerably more value than one that treats the collapse of that boundary as the emotional high point of a young person's coming-of-age story. And until Shades of Pink is willing to separate the genuine good of being seen and heard from the troubling structure of who is doing the seeing and under what professional and power conditions, the story's central relationship remains one that queer audiences, and especially younger queer viewers, looking for models of what healthy recognition and mentorship actually look like, should be encouraged to examine with real critical distance rather than uncomplicated admiration.
I want to have a soulmate. And at my age, I just want to go to the prom and have my first kiss like every other 18-year-old girl. I can coach you. Please. How am I supposed to meet a girl who likes girls if no one in the world knows that I'm gay? Today, I want you to feel like a princess.